Good morning.
Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
What is wrong with the government saying that it will revoke the citizenship of dual nationals who have been convicted of terrorism, in your opinion?
It's a big question, so let's break it down a little bit. Prior to Bill C-24, which has now received royal assent, the old Citizenship Act only allowed the deprivation or revocation of citizenship in one instance, and that's if you lied on your application forms to become a Canadian.
Mm-hmm.
So if you did that, your citizenship could be taken away.
If you were involved in fraud in obtaining the citizenship in the first place.
Right, and very, very few individuals lost their citizenship in that way. Now what they've done is they've dramatically increased the grounds for revocation, and they've lowered the threshold to take away someone's citizenship. And so if you look at it, it's created different classes of citizenship. And I don't know. I mean, ultimately, the government has the mandate, the electoral mandate, to change these sort of fundamental concepts. I'm not sure if Canadians sort of understand the nuances and intricacies.
To you, though, does this new bill, these new powers, does it change what citizenship means?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, on the face of it, taking away citizenship, Canadian citizenship, from terrorists, particularly ISIS is in the news these days, there doesn't seem to be anything wrong with that. But what this law does is that if you are born in Canada, like myself, and don't have a claim to any other citizenship, your citizenship cannot be revoked, no matter what egregious crimes you do against Canada. And so that's the sort of ultimate citizenship. The second stage of citizenship, you have dual nationality, whether you applied for it or not. For example, there's countries that will recognize you as being a citizen even if you've never applied for citizenship.
Mm-hmm.
That includes Pakistan, that includes Iran, that includes Saudi Arabia. And so those individuals, if they go and there's this sort of expanded list of crimes or offenses that if they commit these offenses, their Canadian citizenship can be taken away from them.
So then, in a broad sense, you feel that is now a lesser status when it comes to citizenship, a lesser degree of citizenship?
Well, it's not my view. It's just reality. I mean, my citizenship can't be revoked, and this other person, even though they were born in Canada as well, their citizenship can. So there's a distinction between the two. This is a big, big fundamental change as to the nature of how we understand ourselves as Canadians. Citizenship is being chipped away at. So the Romans, 2,500, 3,000 years ago, the Romans had 5 or 6 different classes of Roman citizens. And these Roman citizens could do different things. And I think that we're in that sort of same, history sort of is repeating itself, where we are going to have sort of different classes of citizenship.
So a dual citizen can have their Canadian citizenship revoked by the minister if a criminal conviction exists. So given that it requires a conviction for terrorism or treason, doesn't that set the bar high enough for the minister to do the revoking? Doesn't that give him discretion only for a very, very thin slice of dual citizens?
So let's take the case of journalist Mohammed Fahmy. He's a dual national. He's Canadian and he's Egyptian, and he was in Egypt, and he's been charged and convicted of terrorism-related offenses. He's been sentenced to more than 5 years. Ergo, he fits the criteria of having his citizenship revoked by Minister Chris Alexander.
Now, in this particular case, Mohammed Fahmy's case, Minister Alexander will not revoke his Canadian citizenship because the government says it has concerns about the integrity of the verdict in Egypt, and the journalist did nothing to warrant having his Canadian citizenship revoked.
Right, but that means that Mr. Alexander is arbitrarily deciding who gets his citizenship revoked and who doesn't. The law doesn't work that way. The law doesn't work on, we'll make sure, hopefully someone who's looking at this will be reasonable and will make sure that there will be no miscarriages of justice. I mean, the law as it's written indicates that an individual like Mr. Fahmy could have his citizenship revoked. And when you do give this level of discretion, it's the fragility of the human condition. Mistakes will be made, and we will see an individual being deprived or stripped of their Canadian citizenship that doesn't deserve it.
But that's not going to come into play very often because the bar has been set so high.
I think the bar has been set kind of super low in the sense of that this has only one ultimate objective, which is it's electoral in its purpose, not necessarily this sort of tool to combat terrorism. Think about it. Chris Alexander has trumpeted this legislation up and down Canada, you would have to have the IQ of room temperature to, not renounce, for example, your other citizenship before going and committing terrorist offenses.
Now, according to polls, this move by the government, this bill to revoke citizenship, has something like 83% support across the country. It suggests that they're just doing what Canadians want.
Sure.
Does that change things at all for you?
It's hard to deal or discuss polls. I mean, as a lawyer, you deal with these sort of big concepts. And if we were to poll the Canadian people, we wouldn't have the Charter of Canadian Rights and Freedoms. We wouldn't have minority protection because, there's a fine line between the rule of the majority, and of course, and there's a distinction between that and democracy. So I don't believe in 51 fools overruling 49 wise men. Ultimately, what Canadians know, or what the polls reflect, is that they're being fed a very, very straightforward perspective, which is, if you're a terrorist, we're going to take Canadian citizenship away from you. And it's hard to argue against that. But to implement the deprivation or revocation of Canadian citizenship and make it align with our values almost beggars the imagination.
Thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure.